Welcome to the fifth in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey. My name is Rob Meager. Today's interview will continue our discussion of the lecture Awakening the Heart Nature, the Flowering of Self-Nature and the Surrender of Compassion and Authenticity, Part 1 of 2. This is a continuation of the interview from February 25th. This lecture was originally given online on June 26, 2013, and it is available in written form in Moksha Dham, an ebook you can order at the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. You can also listen to the full recording of many of these lectures at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/education. And now a little bit of background about Richard Harvey. He is a psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. His work emerged out of the human potential movement of the 1970s. He trained with many teachers in humanistic and transpersonal approaches. He is the founder of Sacred Attention Therapy, a radical new approach to inner work for the 21st century that proposes a three-stage model of human awakening. Richard is the author of Your Essential Self and The Flight of Consciousness, among many other publications. He works with people all around the world, and his forthcoming book is entitled Your Sacred Calling. And it's now my pleasure to welcome Richard to the call. Good to be with you.
Hi, Robert.
Hello. And you have Chomsky there with you this morning.
I'm here with Chomsky.
Actually, it's afternoon your time. Now, I want to pick up where we left off the last time. And as a reminder to those who are listening and watching, as a reminder to myself and to you, I just want to share where we did, in fact, leave off. And where we left off was that very telling, informing story whereby you came across this assault happening in the foyer of a movie theater, and how you looked on with despair, with other emotions as this was taking place. And you described it in a very graphical and audible way, and you also shared how others stood by and witnessed this with you, and the indelible mark that that experience has left on you. And picking up from that point in the interview a few weeks ago, you went on to share an account from a book by Joseph Campbell, whereby there was a policeman who, quote, saved a suicide on the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And the policeman was asked, why did you do that? But why did you put your own life at risk to do that? And his response was one of, I couldn't have lived another moment if I hadn't tried to save that man's life. And then you went on to share the following, and bear with me, and I'll ask the listeners to also bear with me as I provide this background. But Richard, you went on to say, the policeman could no more let this man kill himself than he could let himself die without at least trying to save him. He intervened. Unlike me merely watching the young men kicking and punching that youth in the cinema entrance, the policeman took action. Now I could feel the message of Campbell's story. I could feel it because I had experienced cowardliness I could sense the courage, the great leap in consciousness from egocentric awareness to unity consciousness, which this policeman had expressed. And then the teaching begins in the lecture, and I want to share this as well. Of course, leading up to the question for our discussion here. You go on to share how to understand this gift. How, had I not had this experience, referring to the experience in the cinema foyer, I would not have been able to receive the teaching, the understanding of unity consciousness so profoundly, vividly, and authentically. This authentic and authenticity arguably has served me and many others in my practice who've had the potential for cruelty, emotional, physical, and barbaric cruelty, the capacity to assault and maim, hurt and injure. I may have hindered any number of atrocities between human beings. I have heard of many in my practice, although I can't quantify it. I can be sure that I have helped to avert evil and suffering on many occasions. The links with another antidote from Campbell's In the Flight of Consciousness. It is his meeting with the Guru Sri Krishna Menon, where he asks, since everything is a manifestation of the divine, how can we say no to anything? Brutality, stupidity, and callousness included. Krishna Menon answers him, for you and I, the way is to say yes. Now you go on further, but I'll stop there. And I want to ask, how do we say yes to our attackers? How do we show compassion towards our attackers?
It's important perhaps to hear this exchange between Joseph Campbell and Sri Krishna Menon, because he said, for you and I think the idea we get from the anecdote is that he recognizes in Campbell a kindred spirit. He says, for you and I, the way is to say yes. And I think we should start there and just highlight that, because it's a matter of potential and capacity. You realistically consider your own capacity with regard to this and say, well, am I in a condition of spiritual sadhana, discipline, practice, in which the idea that everything is God can go beyond an idea, go beyond a notion or a teaching of some sort and become a reality for me. However much I know it, can I see it? One thinks of tantric practice, for example, and spending the time in the Ghats. I think we spoke about this last time, and overcoming one's revulsion for all things that are hard to stomach. Hard to really experience, but even if you can experience them in Tantra, you'd go further than that and you would worship the decomposing organs of an animal or of a human being, for that matter. Tantric practitioner even goes so far as to eat the brains. The brains of a corpse, for example. Extraordinary things to see how far you can go in this truth that everything is God, including your nemesis, including your terror, but then and all of the subjects or the objects of your terror and your deepest fears. But the reality of that is unadorned, it's naked, it's for real. Can you stand before that, and therefore are you able to say yes? It is the theme of this talk was to invite compassion where we've drawn a line, where we've decided this is the victim and this is the virtuous and this is this side, and then there's these nasty guys over here and all of that. At the same time that as soon as you start talking to the nasty guys, the protagonists of violence and repulsive acts, that we come to understand. And we come to see it as we get closer, but it highlights our prejudice. So the way to say yes is to start from the certainty, if you will, that it's all divine, it's all God. Then move up along your degrees of tolerance until you find that place, and usually most of us can go a little bit past there if we're motivated, of course, but then find the place where you're really having trouble and dwell there as much and for as long as you can. The breakthrough usually for all of us, of course, is the knowledge through understanding that that person or that event or that atrocity is in here.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's in here then, and it's not out there, now suddenly there's this wonderful revolution. It comes around the other way and say, well, I can deal with it, because you and I, people listening, we all feel to some degree at least disempowered by the world, by the leaders of the world, by politics, by international relationships and all of it. And it's big. And then, of course, there's outer space and universes. And going that way, it looks pretty unreachable. But turn the whole thing around and bring it back in here, or see it for how it really is.
Mm-hmm.
You have enormous influence on all of that. Mm. It isn't out there. Mm-hmm. None of it's out there.
You, as you so often do, intuited where I wanted to go next with the lecture and with a question for you. It was shortly after this point in the lecture that you went on to share of a situation in which the famous American singer-songwriter Bob Dylan, he stood up against what you're calling consensus reality in the lecture and shared some poetic words. And I'll just read this passage, just a little bit of background for the listener. In this passage, Bob Dylan was commenting on Lee Harvey Oswald, the shooter, the assassin of John F. Kennedy, and that famous event. And you write, Dylan took the stage to give his speech. Dylan was there accepting an award for something completely unrelated to John F. Kennedy or Oswald. But he took the stage to give a speech. It would be customary to say, "Thank you very much, 3 bags full, sir," and so on. He go on to say, but instead, he said that he felt an affinity for Lee Harvey Oswald, that he felt some of what he must have felt, that he saw himself in Kennedy's assassin. With this expression of sympathy, he opened the way for everyone to share responsibility for the crime, the idea that everyone was somehow involved and should look in their hearts and share culpability for Kennedy's murder. He broke the division between the righteous accusers and the wretched accused, the scapegoat. We can only begin to imagine the outrage. You ask a very important question leading up to what I'll ask you. You said, what was going on in the youthful Dylan's mind and heart? And what I wanted to ask you, and picking up from the thought you shared just a few minutes ago, Is it so difficult for some to forgive our attackers because it's too painful to see ourselves in them?
Or because there's an obfuscating, a shield, a kind of, there's a knee-jerk reaction, I think we call it. I mean, there's this reactiveness. It's easier to string someone up. It's easier to blame someone. It's easier to scapegoat them than to, and then not to go any further. And one of my exercises which I like to give people is reading these sort of nasty papers that are very partisan. I don't know if you have them where you live, but you do over here in Europe, tabloid newspapers where they seem to like very much to reinforce the prejudice and the judgment and all of this kind of thing. And you can have these wonderful pictures of ultimately really quite neutral looking people, but underneath you call them the monster or something, and immediately you can see in their eyes and in their jaw and everything this sort of nastiness. I mean, we're very quick to be able to project, to transfer our own violence, our own atrocity onto someone else if we're given half a chance. And we know this, it's a lynch mob sort of a mentality. And it's also that what popularly I think we're meant to understand is the police force issue of finding someone and stringing them up, and then everyone's justified. The police have done a good job, justice has been served. I mean, we're all seeing past this now because there is such a tremendous tendency towards blame and unforgiveness at the moment globally in all sorts of ways, and quite a lack of understanding on a deeper level, of course, underneath that. But there's a lot of purging ourselves at the moment by going out to find who's to blame and accountability and all this kind of thing. So, so it seems to be that this is the easier way, and I suppose we go back to, there's that wonderful old classic Golden Bough by James Frazier, in which the scapegoat idea is well documented, which is in primitive tribes. We take somebody out and we send them out to appease the gods or to appease nature, or in the hope that we will have crops and water and rainfall and what have you. But we do that by sacrificing somebody annually. So it's a reflection of nature and the the movement of life underground, that we take someone's life who's chosen, who is an ambivalent figure, because on the one hand they're serving the collective and so they're exalted. On the other hand, of course, they are brought down literally because they die. They're the scapegoat. It's the Christ. It's the one who atones. So this motif lives on. It's the bull sacrifice. It's all these primitive things. We're still doing it on some level. We do it really when we make any one person accountable for the sins of us all.
It reminds me of the teaching in the opportunity that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, and that we have an opportunity in any moment in any day to step back and say, what is this teaching me, instead of trying to exclude ourselves from any responsibility to what is happening and saying that's happening outside me, therefore it's the cause and I'm the effect, whereas it's the other way around. I'm the cause and what I'm seeing is the effect. We fail to welcome the lessons inherent in any of these situations, and are very quick, as you said, to want to project the blame, project the fear, project ourselves out onto the world, because we don't like what it is we're seeing.
the world I see is not the real world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's a quote shortly after that point, and it's very interesting because recently, with some sharing via social media, this quote offered some interesting dialogue between myself and one of the people following our initiatives online. And the quote at this point in the lecture, you started to talk about celebrities having charisma. And I won't go into all that you share about celebrities having charisma and impact, but I'll just share the quote. I didn't realize actually how significant. It's interesting. I must have intuited this dialogue and exchange I recently had with someone about this quote, but the quote was, "Fight God and you lose belief in your divinity before you are ready to handle it, and you pay the price of self-destruction." And I wanted to ask you, can this self-destruction, however, also lead to your liberation?
I don't think that's the self-destruction. I think you know this, don't you? I don't think that's the self-destruction here we're talking about. So there's always this ambivalent figure again, isn't there? So self-annihilation in the spiritual path, of course, is completely different to self-destruction in the psychological sense. And we should even say that the relationship is clear. It is that you grow this flower of self to its most splendid bloom, and then you offer it if you're spiritually inclined, of course, because there's only two ways to go at that point, which is the apex of your life, and that's either you die, and that's a nihilism, if you will. There's nothing other than this tremendous bloom, or you take the opportunity to offer it up to the divine source, or return it, or to fulfill it even further. And that isn't the self-destruction here that comes from fighting God, which in a sense, of course, is fighting yourself. So it's good we can say things that sound similar, but there is this curtain, as it were, or what do we call them, a veil, as it were, or even a set of veils. And one of the things that happens somehow through this set of veils is that everything kind of turns, really. And it turns in a way that it changes it inversely. So it really does turn upside down. So we don't want to largely support self-destruction or in any of its forms on a psychological level, not because we are, and this is all tentative, by the way. I mean, I believe all of this and I practice it, but I'm just offering it to you and the listeners. We don't support self-destruction for the simple reason it's not real. It's not a moral imperative. There's nothing wrong as such in suicide in certain circumstances. Why not, in a sense? And in another sense, people are killing emotions and the life force daily anyway, momentarily from hour to hour. So what can you say about it? It's a normalcy, really. But the reason we don't support self-destruction is because it isn't authentic. It's not a real event. You can know more. You can't do it. It can't be done. It's not effective, you might say. But what looks similar on the other side of the veil in the spiritual world is not only effective, it's mandatory. And the reason is that spirituality, insofar as it refers us to the divine source, isn't personal. That's not real either. So we're all the time tending towards reality, aren't we? And through our personal authenticity, authenticity, which leads us to the realization that it's not personal at all. But we have to realize it on a personal level first, because that's the nature of the delusion, but it's the nature of the door out, as it were, of that field of delusion. You realize in time everything that's truly spiritual, everything that's true, everything that's real, and everything that relates to the divine source isn't personal, isn't individual, isn't of division or separation or individualized identity. It's just not. So the only reason for following that movement away from self-destruction towards the spiritual surrender or annihilation of self is simply that it's not true in the first place.
There's a prayer, a Buddhist prayer, as part of a practice called POWA, P-H-O-W-A, if the listeners haven't heard about it. It comes out of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And this prayer is just 5 lines. And in that prayer, you actually pray for the death of the soul you're working with. But it can also be used. It can also be used for yourself. And so you actually pray for your death, so that in the triumph of your death, you may be able to benefit all of life. And it took me a while, because those words, in the way that it shares it, again, talking about flipping, reality and the veils, it took me a while to realize, or at least to come to an awareness in me. It's not talking about my physical death. If anything, it's talking about my ego death, and it's talking about my identification with myself. And yes, that is something that I pray I can let go of, I can transcend, to bring it in the context of, the sacred attention therapy model. It's something that I can transcend, and if I can, indeed, I'll be able to benefit all of life.
You put me in mind of, I don't think explicitly I went into it in this lecture, but we did, as you've pointed out, talked about Bob Dylan, for example, talked about celebrity and charisma and related it to the scapegoat, as I recall, and all this kind of thing. And there's something rather important about real artists in whatever discipline of art, and it is that they are the poets, they are the blues singers, they are the people who express the suffering of life for all of us. I mean, Dylan's an obvious example for many people. He remains someone who can say things that we can't say, and he can say it for all of us. You get it with art, of course, you get it with poetry, you get it with sculpture, you get it with dance. All of the different spheres of art, when they are true. And what I mean by that is true art bridges the worlds, from the inner to the outer, from the human to the spiritual, between the secular and the divine. So when art is truly art, as opposed to something more superficial or commercialized or whatever, then we have a ritual, we have a ceremony of, it's a priest role, really, in which the singer or the poet or the artist expresses the suffering that we feel, and so therefore, of course, points towards it being impersonal, because he or she can express it in that way, and so many of us can feel it, and feel its discharge, its release in the singing, in the song, in the poem, in the work of art. Then something collective takes place. It's very important, and I think it's significant to see and remember that the way in which art has become less important now over the last 50 years, for example, in our culture, is part of the Kali Yuga, is part of the age of ignorance. Art is more important than ever. It's it's always going to be important, but art and the priest and the function of religion, these are all the same things. And I find that for example, I think we talked a little bit about this in the lecture, the celebrity with the charisma who doesn't understand it, doesn't understand tremendous gift. And I don't think most celebrities do really understand the divine source of the brightness that they're bringing, which is why you notice very often as their lives go on, it gets darker and may even end over soon. Understand this role, this position. And personally, they don't necessarily have to be advanced individuals in any shape or form, because it's something that's coming through.
It is in this lecture that you talk about that is that relationship among or between the celebrity and the divine, but there are also some other lectures that comes into the dialogue. You go on to share an interesting passage on hubris towards the end of the lecture, and I'm going to read it. It's just a short passage. Humanity's collective soul today is in a state of hubris. Hubris stands for presumption and overconfidence, pride with a lack of respect for others, originally toward the gods. Classically, the protagonist is led into a fatal event that causes great harm or damage. This is caused by a hamartia, an error which leads to divine retribution, a severe punishment, either causing disaster or ending in death. And I wanted to ask, this hubris that you speak of, this presumption or overconfidence, this pride with a lack of respect for others, originally towards the gods, it seems rampant throughout humanity today. What's the antidote for this hubris?
Adulthood. I mean, it's a short answer, isn't it? And it's something that's also fading in this time of ignorance. In my book, Your Essential Self, and in the training that the Sacred Attention Therapy training, I'm making it quite clear, I hope, we should aim for adulthood in the psychobiological stage in which it is appropriate at this time, in this era, and that is around 40. Early 40s, much later than we think. This doesn't change the fact that culturally and popularly we live, because of commercial and political forces, in societies now in the West, which is East, West, and everywhere really, that exalts infantilization. I mean, even 50-year-old, 60-year-old people want to look as if they're 20 or 25 or worse. So, this is absurd. I mean, it's utterly absurd because it's anti-life force. I mean, it's not to be purist about this and to say, why shouldn't an older woman dress up and look somewhat youthful, or why shouldn't you and I knock around in shorts from time to time? I mean, yeah, it's all sort of fine, but the idea that we should look like kids forever and we should not want to look old, I mean, we just need to change all of that because of the associations with aging and the wisdom and the life experience, and particularly the exchange across stages of life, that we lose into the bargain. So, older people listening to pop music and doing stuff they did when they were 12, I mean, we want to change this model somehow. Hubris, then, is associated with adolescence. It's that time of self-importance and false pride and lack of confidence that involves doing something gauche, these kinds of things, and not having a clue about consequences or things you learn in maturity. And I think that at some point I need to go much deeper into the part of my book, Your Essential Self, that charts the stages of life. Because even when I was writing that, I realized, this is a three-parter. This is a big book, really. And I think what I want to propose is that as collectives in society, we need to recognize these rites of passage and movements through the stages. I've got a feeling I might be repeating myself, but just very briefly, I'm working currently with several people in the early 40s who are psychobiologically, not out of my suggestion, but quite naturally moving into the challenges of adulthood. Well, by this, I mean you leave the childhood totally behind, even the 20s, even that development, and you move into what the 40s are truly about. Most people aren't getting a glimpse of what the 40s are truly about because they're still 5.
That's right.
I'm sorry to be so pessimistic about it, but it's just how it is. I think we have to say it how it is. So if you wind up being 48 or 49, going into 50s, and you're still about 8 years old, you're in a lot of trouble. You're in a lot of trouble psychologically, biologically, and in terms of the evolution and stages of your life. And partly it's because we don't have the conceptual framework.
I may have, I think I've shared this with you before, and it may even have been in this milieu. But there's a dear student who attends one of my discussion groups on a regular basis, and they're the type of personality who tends to be very quiet, but once they've had enough, they'll come forth and they'll share. And on this one given gathering, the discussion seemed to focus around this concept of enlightenment. And this dear soul listened very patiently for the better part of an hour, but finally couldn't hold it in anymore and burst out saying, "Enlightenment? The best most people can hope for in this lifetime is to grow up." And they were being very sarcastic and they were being very dramatic. But their point was just what you were sharing. And we talk about these concepts of enlightenment, but that's inherent with actually maturing in the context of your 3 stages model of human awakening. It is, for I think a student of your work and for someone going through the material, going through that process of inner work, and shedding the early life veils, one sees the truth in that idea of growing up, growing into our true selves, growing into authenticity, and letting go of all of that conditioning that was born into, from, and out of our childhood.
It's interesting what we're saying there. You got it growing into, growing up, or James Hillman, the late James Hillman, Jungian psychologist, talked about growing down. But then he was very interested in the soul. So this idea of like Thomas More, who was in the wake of Hillman, they were very interested in the soul in the contemporary society. So James Hillman, I think it is right, I think I'm recalling this right, spoke of growing down as being a more apt phrase than growing up. When we live in a whether we know it or not, we live in a under the influence of a religious idea of going up, of transcendence in that sense. Growing into is very nice because it avoids the up or the down, and maybe can have a bit of both. Because we grapple with soul and spirit and our humanness, after all. So perhaps we should grow into.
I'll leave it on those wise words. And when we come together again, we'll start looking at part 2 of the lecture, Awakening the Heart Nature.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Richard.
Goodbye.
Bye for now.